host, Richard RJ Eskow. West Virginia is certainly in the news these days, not only for its new draconian abortion ban, but also for the now notorious side deal that its Senator Joe Manchin made with Democratic Party Senate leadership in order to get the Inflation Reduction Act passed. And here to discuss that with us now is West Virginia organizer Troy Miller. He is an organizer for Social Security Works as well as a Democratic Party executive there. We know him around here as the executive producer of The Zero Hour. So he and I are together every week, but not often both on the same side of the camera. So first of all, Troy Miller, welcome to The Zero Hour.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here as always, Richard, with you and our audience here. Always a pleasure to be on this side of the camera, and always a pleasure to talk with you, no matter how grim the material may be.
And speaking of grim material, okay, so quick précis, Chuck Schumer and the leadership made some promises to Joe Manchin so that he would give his vote to the Inflation Reduction Act. Now the bill has come due on those promises, which basically involve passing a law that would ease permitting for environmentally destructive projects. And the first one of those projects, the one that Manchin really, really wanted, is in your state of West Virginia, meaning that your senator is pushing a project in your state called the Mountain Valley Pipeline that, in my understanding, is quite environmentally harmful. But is that true?
I think the people in the pathway of the pipeline certainly think it's not a great deal. The people who are losing land to eminent domain, the people who are losing land that their family has owned for generations. Not to mention just the raw effects of running a pipeline through a mountain and valley area is incredibly destructive environmentally. And what really boggles my mind about all of this is that God bless Joe Manchin. I'm thankful that the Inflation Reduction Act got passed. There's a lot of great provisions in there. He does have explaining to do about the Mountain Valley Pipeline, especially when he's running around and saying that this will bring down domestic energy prices. This is a pipeline that is almost definitely most of the gas is going to go towards export. And it's one thing to say that he kind of wants to have both sides of this, it seems like. He wants us to be the world superpower. Those are the words that he has used multiple times. He wants America to be the world superpower, and one of the ways he wants us to do that is through energy dominance. He apparently sees the war in Russia and Ukraine right now as a tremendous opportunity to get American gas into the European markets to bring down prices for our strategic allies. There is a lot of sort of realpolitik that makes a lot of sense there if we ignore the realities of the climate crises that we are seeing right now. The last time I was on here, we were talking about flooding down in southern West Virginia and 1,000-year, 100-year floods that are happening far more frequently than previously expected, and previously what our engineering had previously deemed a 1,000-year flood, and the probabilities thereof much greater now. Since then, eastern Kentucky has been flooded out, completely underwater. Vast amounts of communities and community resources like Apple Shop and a few community radio stations down there, large archives of places down there, completely lost to the flooding. And at least one reporter I saw, this was just last week, I think, was taking down, I think maybe BBC reporters, and the reporters asked, "Where's the government?" And the local Appalachian reporter had to go, "I don't know." This is where we are as the result of our current climate crisis. And running this pipeline and exporting all of the gas that would be necessary to affect global prices is absolutely going to, it'll be 10 years before we see the absolute impacts of pumping that gas out, but it is going to exacerbate problems that are already very bad. It's throwing fuel on the fire, adding natural gas to a world already on fire. And, beyond the realpolitik at the strict, risk game level, right? Where everything is just kind of armies and resources on a map, now set that board on fire. And that's more or less where we are now.
That's a good analogy, Troy. But and I know you're a West Virginia Democrat. Joe Manchin is a Democrat. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I've got to say that his logic doesn't really hold for me because, first of all, I don't know how long it takes to build this pipeline, but I'm sure it's years, right? We don't know what will happen with the Ukraine war. It may be, hopefully it will be resolved. It will be settled. There'll be peace again. Oil will start flowing again. So to start something now, on the basis of that seems shaky. Maybe I'm just a cynic, but I just kind of think West Virginia's got a lot of politicians in both parties who are in the pockets of the fossil fuel companies. Am I being too negative?
No, that's absolutely correct. And the the reality is it's not a light switch, right? You do have to build the pipeline. And as Senator Manchin has told reporters outright, if it weren't for the holdups in the permitting process, holdups, right? That's what we
Right.
That's what the oil industry refers to as public input. All of these holdups and public input and public hearings about whether this is a good thing for the communities that are going to have the pipeline driven through them. This is, I think he said it, that's why it's cost $6 million or $60 million instead of $3 or $30 million, wherever the decimal lies there. And he's basically complaining that the project costs too much because there's too much public input, which is as anti-democratic of a small d democratic a position as one could take, in my opinion. I don't know exactly what he stands to benefit. I think that there is something to be said for his donors and who he has represented in all throughout his entire political career. And we're still in this hangover period too of Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton pushing natural gas as the bridge fuel, right? It's not really clean, but it's cleaner than coal, right? The whole thing. And she promoted that all through Western Europe, all through Eastern Europe, and all through America too. Now, the kicker to all of this is at the same time we're talking about building this pipeline and developing out natural gas resources, we're also talking about building a cracking plant, a natural gas cracking plant outside of Pittsburgh in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. Now, what happens at a cracking plant is you take the natural gas, the ethylenes, the propylenes, or the ethane and the propanes and all this, and you crack them apart, and they reform with double bonded molecules, and they become ethylene, propylene, and the other ones that become single-use plastic. So it's not only not going towards energy, and this was true back in 2012 too, when I told members of the Hillary Clinton or the Secretary Clinton State Department that this was the reality. You cannot tell us that you are creating more energy and more American energy, and it's cleaner than coal, and also turn around and turn a lot of that gas into single-use plastic. It takes energy to crack the molecules apart, and it takes energy to it removes energy from the system by turning it into single-use plastic, and then it takes energy to distribute it out to all the grocery stores to where inevitably they'll end up in one of the trees outside in any of our streets, right? That is not promoting energy security. There's no way you can have it both ways.
No, plastic is actually a tremendous environmental hazard. We should be getting off disposable or single-use plastics altogether. There's now a problem with microplastics in fish wildlife and our own biology sometimes. So that's a disaster. I'm curious though, Troy, this is a little bit of a sidetrack, but do you know how this so-called cracking is actually done? It sounds to me like something that requires like tremendous amounts of heat, energy, what have you, but I have no idea. What is cracking?
I am not a chemical engineer, though my mother actually did work at one of these cracking plants out in Indiana back in the late 70s, 80s area. And that is basically, you have to superheat it, you have to combust the gas, and then let it cool and reform and process it all through. It is an incredibly energy intensive process. And frankly, had my mother, excuse me, not worked in a cracking plant, I would not have been savvy to the realities of this back 10, 15 years ago when they were first proposing this, when they were developing the Marcellus Shale around my home area of Wheeling, West Virginia. I'm Out in the Eastern Panhandle now, we have no natural gas development out here. There's unlikely to ever be any. There's very little gas, and Western Maryland and Maryland has already banned fracking. So this area is relatively safe from it. Further south, there's plenty of gas. Further east or further west, further north, Pennsylvania, plenty of gas. And the question is, what do you do with all of it? So one of the things is, of course, the demand for plastics is there to fill. One of the other issues with all of this, though, isn't even where the end of life cycle of the gas molecules after they're fracked out of the ground and the water is ruined, the sediment is destroyed, and have done unknown things. We're going to live out the realities of the repercussions of fracking. If they're anything like Oklahoma, we know that it causes more earthquakes. But beyond that, the industry has never been well regulated. There's a major difference between the natural gas industry and the fracking industry in particular, and the coal industry and the mining industry in particular. The coal industry is generally it's a few large actors who are as well regulated as one could be under our regulatory regime. There is an accountability when you have large actors that you know the name, like Massey Energy. With the natural gas companies for the last 15 to 20 years in the Marcellus region, it's a lot of fly-by-night operations. It's a lot of crews set up with 15 people and some drilling equipment, and they set up these pads, and the entire game is to get as much gas out as possible, get as much profit out as possible, declare bankruptcy, and not deal with the well, not cap the wells properly. And there are so many of these wells, and we have such a weak regulatory regime in America across the environmental spectrum that we don't even know exactly how many wells are seeping methane actively right now across western Pennsylvania, eastern Pennsylvania, across the Marcellus region and beyond in Appalachia. The other thing that both the coal companies and the natural gas companies have enjoyed in recent decades is that this happens in remote places. So when something goes wrong, you're counting on maybe a dozen families around who have to note what's going wrong, then have to know the processes to report what's going wrong, then have to hope that the 5 regulators who are looking at this down in Charleston, if it's that many, will actually get to their complaint in the pile, and then hope that they'll actually do something about it. Yeah, 2 years later, maybe the harms are realized and rectified. Unlikely. More than likely, you're dealing with struggling with proving the causation versus correlation of cancers and health problems in these areas that did not have them before, right? And that is the game we have to play in America. In Europe, these projects are generally regulated under a strict precautionary principle, meaning that the processes and the technologies have to be proven safe before they can be implemented widespread. In America, we do it completely opposite. If things are assumed innocent until proven guilty, and proving a process like fracking to be harmful to individuals or communities collectively is really tough. It is not so easy as just and God bless Josh Fox, having Josh Fox go out there and present a documentary. That's not enough rigorous scientific evidence to get the regulatory action that we need. And this is a fundamental problem with America's regulatory regime. Joe Manchin is complaining about permitting. I would argue that our permitting regime, while it is absolutely burdensome and onerous and there's unnecessary red tape, I'm sure it is far too lax nonetheless. And our precautionary principle is far too weak.
Oh, I'm sure. And by the way, multitasking, I have looked up this process of cracking gas, and the most relevant thing here is, and I quote, the thermal cracking of natural gas proceeds at a very high temperature, as you said, resulting in olefins, mostly ethylene or propylene, Gesundheit. The temperature in a gas cracker exceeds 1,000 degrees centigrade. So that's really hot. Multiplying from centigrade to Fahrenheit, I get really hot as a result. And the fact is that takes energy. So we're really, we're not talking about a cleaner, quote unquote, alternative. We're talking about mass producing more fossil fuels at a time that the scientists tell us the only way to address the fossil fuel crisis and climate change is by producing no more new sources of fossil fuel. And yet here we are, the deal that was cut. As you say, the IRA has some good provisions in it, but the deal that was cut with your senator is to make this permitting process basically waive it for projects like the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Now, I don't know. I've been following a little bit the pushback on that. Have you been following it at all?
I mean, to what degree?
Well,
Yes.
I'm talking mostly about the people in Congress who are saying, well, we didn't make this deal. We're not honor bound to honor it. And as well as the activist group saying, don't honor the dirty deal. I mean, I've heard
Right.
that kind of rhetoric between Joe Manchin and Chuck Schumer or whatever. Have you been following that too?
Yeah, and so there's a couple things. One, Senator Manchin has had to come on. Hoppy Kercheval is the major radio host here in West Virginia, who, when Senator Manchin feels like he wants to talk to West Virginians as a whole, it seems like he goes to Hoppy Kercheval. And he was on there saying this wasn't a side deal. This was not a side deal. This was always part of the deal. And, so this whole rhetoric about how it's a side deal is BS. And him and Senator Schumer had worked this out, and he told Senator Schumer that Senator Schumer wouldn't like it. I find most kind of funny in the dark way Senator Manchin's complaint that Bernie Sanders or Senator Sanders and the Republicans are now joining together to kill this deal as part of revenge politics. And I love the idea that it's revenge politics rather than the fact that if you try to come up with policies that offend no one and are super centrist in all of this, you're actually going to create policies that nobody wants, right? And this should be one of the things that I hope every centrist Democrat in America is starting to realize. There's no way to be a centrist on the issue of Roe v. Wade. You can't thread that needle. You can't split that baby. And that's the point of the story, by the way. You can't split the baby. The baby has to remain whole and go to its actual mother. And so Senator Manchin has, I think what he's really seeing is the 40 years of centrist policy making that he's pushed for, and the realization that there's no room for this. You have no allies anywhere if you try to make everyone on. And he's upset that the Republicans won't join with him. Well, he kind of screwed the Republicans with the IRA as far as they're concerned.
Right.
I don't think this is revenge politics. I don't think he should have ever been expecting to get the Republican votes. They are very good at standing together to make sure nothing gets done, and they don't care, because when nothing gets done under a Democratic president, a Democratic Congress, that gives them fodder to say, hey, we're going to get some things done. Now, the things they're going to do are awful, right? They're going to do things like destroy Social Security, destroy Medicare, and then have it voted on by their members in the dark of night about what people can deserve for the next 5 years.
Right, exactly. Of course.
Right? These are their big plans, but they're willing to sit on those and wait on those. 40 years for the overturn of Roe. They're willing to sit there and wait, and as long as Democrats don't do anything, 40 years of not codifying Roe,
Right.
they win. And so I shouldn't be stunned at all anymore by any of this, but it seems to me incredible that Senator Manchin can stand there and go, well, Bernie Sanders and these Republicans are joining together out of revenge politics. It's
Well,
not
the
revenge
Republicans-
politics. This is the Senate, buddy.
Yeah, I've spent the last 20 years, Troy, weighing in against all this bipartisan backroom deal making and all this. But I do have to admit, I had a moment where I was like, well, they made a deal to get the bill passed. How will they ever make a deal with Manchin again? But two things changed my mind. One was, first of all, Raul Grijalva, who's been on the program not in a while, but Representative Grijalva said, well, I wasn't part of that deal. Nobody in the House was part of that deal. Nobody asked us. We're against it. So that was number one. But number two was I was talking to one, a number of the activist groups are pushing back against this deal. And I said, well, they'll never be able to do a deal with Manchin again. He'll feel backstabbed and, with a 50-50, they need him. And the reaction I got, which made sense, it was, so what? Either they'll get a majority or they won't have, a majority next time, but we don't need Manchin anymore either way. So to that extent, I guess if blocking this side deal was breaking, was giving the shaft to Joe Manchin, honestly, I don't feel bad about that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And one of the things that there's so much that's still dawning on me through this election cycle. Here in West Virginia, we're in a particularly strange place because neither of our senators are on the ballot this year. And yet the Senate is entirely where national politics are paying attention to. That being said, there are 4 Appalachian states with contested races right now that if all 4 of those Senate races are won in Pennsylvania, in North Carolina, in Kentucky, and in Ohio, then we have 4 more blue progressive Democrats, and we can discuss how progressive anyone is. Absolutely, speaking of Tim Ryan, for instance, after the election, but we can have 4 actual senators from Appalachia who are representing Appalachia, and they aren't Joe Manchin. And as long as they're to the left of Joe Manchin, we can get a lot more done. And this is a way that we can make Joe Manchin less relevant. And again, I not something I particularly delight in saying. I am a member of the Democratic Executive Committee here in West Virginia at both the county and the state level. I don't want to be necessarily rooting for my senator to become less relevant, but he also has a lot of work to do to make sure that he's communicating with us and understands from the bottom up what West Virginians actually want. We can make him less relevant while making Appalachia more relevant in the Senate. And if we can achieve an Appalachian solidarity, we can start seriously achieving the Blue-Green Alliance work that we need to have if we're going to have a clean energy revolution. There is going to be no green or clean energy revolution in America without the participation of Appalachia. We are always going to be one of the places that powers this country because of our geographical location, because of our resources, and because of the workforce and the people. There's no way to, coal mining shouldn't ever come back in the way that it was. It was never a particularly good thing for this region to begin with. People like to think about the 60s and 70s when there were good paying union coal jobs in this state before the companies automated away all of those jobs, by the way. And that is what happened. It is not environmental regulation that killed tens of thousands of jobs in the coal fields here. It was automation. It was deliberate by the companies to make capital intensive investments and do away with labor because they had lost to labor, because labor had to shed blood in this state in order to get the good union paying jobs that people now choose to remember. But you go back to the 20s, you go back 100 years ago to what the coal camps looked like, people were treated worse than mules because the mules were owned by the companies and needed to be replaced. If a man died, they could just get another immigrant or a freed black man to fill that job. And so that's never coming back, and it shouldn't ever come back. But what is incredible is the battery manufacturing that we can do in West Virginia. I don't necessarily want to promote any part of the coal industry, but there are a lot of rare earth minerals involved with coal mining in the waste part of the coal mining process that could be used to bolster our national defense, to bolster our energy security, and to bolster American manufacturing. And I think we all agree on that would be a fundamentally good thing. And what I'll say is when Appalachia is doing well, when Appalachian communities are doing well, which is difficult for people to imagine because of all of the tropes like the Beverly Hillbillies and the Hatfield and McCoys and all of, which by the way is propaganda to get people against us. It's no different than talking about a welfare queen in Baltimore. It's
No,
the same sort of,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
and when Appalachia is doing well, though, America does well. When Appalachian workers do well, American workers do well. And this is what I'm absolutely fighting for. So if that means making Senator Manchin a little less relevant and making West Virginian representation, Democratic representation in the Senate a little less relevant, I'll take it. He'll have to work with Cory Booker. He'll have to work with, I'm drawing a blank on who it is down in North
Brooker.
Carolina. He'll have to work with J.D. Vance. Or not J.D. Vance. Oh, geez.
No. Yeah.
The opposite of J.D. Vance, John
Right.
Fetterman. And that would be good. More representation for more Appalachian communities in the Senate would be a good thing. The Senate is fundamentally the less democratic of the chambers, and we know that. And that's why we should be looking highly suspect at any side deal that was negotiated in the Senate without the participation of members in the House, which is truly the more democratic. You don't have to like everything that comes out of either chamber, but we can absolutely accept that the House is the more small d democratic chamber of those two. And if Joe Manchin didn't bother to get their agreement, he didn't bother to do the due diligence to get the popular agreement of the people, the constituencies of those people either. He cannot be one senator who speaks for an entire state. That is not how our system works. That would be a monarchy or a fiefdom or something.
And it would be a black guy to Chuck Schumer, but that's okay. But before we go, I like your point about the four Appalachian states, and while I don't know that Kentucky's winnable, certainly Fetterman's doing well in Pennsylvania. Certainly, a couple of the other candidates have a shot. Has there been any talk about a kind of progressive Appalachian alliance that would cover multiple states?
I think there's a lot of people in Appalachia who are working across this in a lot of different in the three dimensions I really want to work on in Appalachia and beyond are a Zoomer Boomer alliance, as our friend Alex Lawson refers to it, getting the coalition of people even younger than myself and people even older than yourself and getting everyone in between on a coalition. The Blue-Green Alliance, another dimension. We need the environment and labor coalitions to be working together to make sure that we have an equitable transition and a just transition into a new economy, into a new not fossil fuel-based economy. And we need an urban-rural solidarity as well. Because the problems that are happening in inner city Baltimore, in Anacostia, where our flagship station here is, We Act Radio, are very similar. They're the same struggles that we see in the haulers in West Virginia. And one thing I want to, I just kept on forgetting to mention about the deal with the Mountain Valley Pipeline is this egregious reality that there's this tactic called court stripping that has been talked about for decades. It was really explored thoroughly by now Chief Justice John Roberts when he was working in the Reagan White House, looking at how Republicans could overturn Roe and strip the court's authority from it. This is a fairly radical proposition. People have been terrified of proposing this because what happens when the next majority comes in? Then they pass legislation that codifies what they want, which is why we've been told now for several years, and Tom Hartman and I worked on this together with The Hidden History of the Supreme Court of the United States and the Betrayal of America, I think is the full title of that book. But we could pass legislation that codified Roe. We can pass legislation that overturns Citizens United. We can pass legislation that gets dark money completely out of politics and strip the court's power of review out of it. The only reason that hasn't been seriously considered is because what happens when the Republican majority comes in and they do the same thing opposite. So it's absolutely absurd that this traditionalist, hold on, let me just finish on this.
Okay.
This arbiter of the Senate, this arbiter of Senate traditions who doesn't want to undo the filibuster. It's not even a real tradition. that he has written in a provision to strip the courts of review of the permitting processes that he's writing a law to get over supersede is just so mind-boggling to me and hypocritical. And
And
any
you're
other
speaking of Manchin, just to be
absolutely,
clear.
and I'm
Yeah,
speaking
okay.
of my senator, and I think that it's a bridge too far. And if we're willing to explore that as an option to get this pipeline through, we need to be willing. He needs to seriously reconsider overturning or getting rid of the filibuster so that we can get a lot more done. And
We have
I
to.
couldn't let this discussion pass by without highlighting that, because that made my jaw drop last night when I saw that the court trimming provision was written today.
That's really interesting, and that's a great point. It's also a great point, by the way, and we'll have to explore it more at some other point. This sort of bias, this bigotry, this prejudice against people they call rednecks, and this against rural people in general. I've thought about that before. How it's absolutely the worst kind of negative stereotyping. I think which shows the X-Files. Had this horrible segment about inbreeding hillbillies. Yep. And, this is like, if they had done that about any other group in America, you would rightfully be, canceled, right? And I think we've made progress, but I think people got to understand that all working people, as you said so well, share the same goals, share the same needs, share the same issues, and no working person deserves that kind of bias. So I just want to add that I'm really glad you brought that up.
Absolutely, and it's we're still dealing with the repercussions of a few things that Senator Clinton or Secretary Clinton, I guess at that time, said, referring to whole groups of the population as deplorable. And talking about how we're going to put a whole lot of coal miners out of work. Now, she did follow that up with, we're going to put them in work with clean jobs, right, or voting, or whatever the thing was at that time. But it's this marginalization, it's this otherization, and it works completely across dimensions. Just like I said, I don't see any difference between that type of bigotry. And it's difficult because because first of all, Appalachia is diverse. There is a lot more than just white people here. But
absolutely, yeah.
Even so, it's not very popular to say that the white people in Appalachia have encountered bigotry, but it is true. And it really, when we were at Netroots, and you couldn't attend, but when I was at Netroots a month or so ago, I ran into someone who was pushing for DC statehood. And I said, "Oh yeah, we act radio, we love you, all this movement, all this, and I'm from West Virginia, and solidarity." And she said, "Oh wow, you're from West Virginia. You're probably the first West Virginian I've ever liked, because of this mentality that, well, she's a young black woman in D.C. The state of West Virginia must be hostile to her. Appalachia must be hostile to her, and it's not true." But there are enough instances of racism and bigotry everywhere that you can find them here in West Virginia too.
How many people know that West Virginia broke away from Virginia because it didn't want to be part of the Confederacy? I mean, start there, right?
Right. Which I will only put the caveat on that of the landowning class in Western Virginia also didn't want to be answerable to Richmond anymore, and took a tremendous opportunity to separate from the more genteel British descended Richmond group there. But how many people likewise know that the UMWA in West Virginia and in Appalachia was the first desegregated union in the country?
Absolutely. So, all right, there's a million more things we could talk about.
Richard. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
And thank you so much for coming before the camera and talking about West Virginia politics with us. It's always great to do this. So Troy Miller, West Virginia organizer for Social Security Works and executive producer of the Zero Hour. Always great talking with you.
Likewise, Richard. Appreciate you. See you on the other side of the camera.
Yep, and we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.